right, so next up we have another panel. I'm going to invite 4 panelists this time around. I hope we have enough mics.
We have 4 mics.
We have 4, oh, so we will have to share one mic. Whoever's on whichever couch here. Okay.
Sorry. Are we using this chat?
Yeah,
right.
There's one. All right, so this panel is, the title is Bridging Privacy into Cosmos. When putting together this event, we felt like a lot of what we were focusing on was Cosmos with a sprinkle of privacy. There is a lot happening in privacy, and so with this panel, what we're actually going to be doing is talking to 4 privacy-focused projects, 2 of which are connected to the Cosmos ecosystem already, one of which is deeply in it, but 2 which are less connected. And I thought this was actually a cool moment for the Cosmos community to also get to know what's happening in privacy. So let's start with the project that you did already hear about today, Penumbra. Do you want to just say a little bit about yourself and the project?
All right. My name is Henry. I guess, so I gave a little bit of a brief overview of what we're building in the talk that I did. But the punchline, I guess, is that we're trying to build up a private DEX. And the thought process there is that trading is a really interesting use case for bootstrapping privacy because it's a case where people have a financial incentive to not disclose their information. And so you could potentially change this kind of existing dynamic where a lot of the time when people build private systems, it ends up being kind of like, okay, here's our private X, right? And it does X, and it's private, and it's like kind of worse at doing X, but like it's private, and you should like privacy, and like, you know, everybody thinks that privacy is good, so you should use our product. And like, unfortunately, I think that that doesn't really work as a product. And the hope is that with trading, it's a case where privacy, thought of as kind of control over the disclosure of information, has this very concrete kind of financial incentive, and maybe we can harness people's like kind of naked self-interest to bootstrap this like private infrastructure.
Awesome.
Like, can we actually be better at doing X because it is private rather than, you know, being having some kind of trade-offs?
That's awesome. Adrian?
All right.
Maybe also mention your connection to the Cosmos world.
Yeah, hi, I'm Adrian. Yeah, my connection to the Cosmos world is I joined as the 3rd core protocol engineer on Cosmos in like 2017. And sort of built multiple companies out of the space, including a validator. And so what is Anoma? Anoma is a suite of protocols and mechanisms for privacy-preserving human coordination in a very self-sovereign fashion. When you think of human coordination, right, that can mean very simple things, such as being able to express access control on your wallet, but it can also mean very complex things, such as on an ephemeral level, wanting to buy Starbucks coffee and offsetting the carbon cost at the same time, or on a very permanent level, being able to define that whenever you interact with the financial system, you always want to make sure that you're buying fair trade things. And Anoma allows all of these things to happen in a very programmable and intuitive fashion. And I think maybe one of the main things here is that, well, one thing we have to realize is that we need way more information density in how we interact with the world. Right? When you think of something like an election or of the financial system, it's very an information reductive step where you sort of try to break down things into single points that you can coordinate around, whether this is a binary choice in an election or a single price for a cup of coffee. But real life is way more complex than this. And we should allow people to be able to express these like very complex preferences that they may have in relation to their environment. Where when I buy coffee, I not only care about the price point of the coffee, I also care about whether it was sustainably sourced, whether the CO2 cost is offset. And yeah, this is really the idea with Anoma, to allow very high information density to be automatically computed over, and so for people to permanently express their preferences in relation to the world in order to automate a bunch of these things, so that I can say I always want to buy carbon neutral energy and I have to do this once, and then for the next 10 years it's just automatically done. But I can also update these kind of preferences. Yeah, and of course everything in a privacy preserving manner, because as we discover, privacy is fundamentally important, because a bunch of things start breaking if we don't have privacy.
Got it. Emre?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Emre. I'm with O1 Labs. O1 Labs is one of the main contributors of Mina protocol. Mina protocol is building a private and secure way to access Web3. It started as a, using ZK primitives as a project that has full node security with just a few kilobytes of data. So that has been live on mainnet for over a year now as a new blockchain. And now in the coming months, we're looking to enable easy ZK programmability, where anyone can deploy using super easy SDK and TypeScript ZK apps on the Mina network and be able to share their data in a private manner, where they make attestations instead of sharing all of their data onto smart contracts on the blockchain. And when you combine that, super small data, full node security with this, that enables Mina to become kind of this private user data layer to any other layer 1 ecosystem, whether that's Cosmos or anywhere else. So that's what we're working on.
And maybe one thing about Mina is it was one of the first, if not the first, to kind of showcase this type of technique called recursion in ZK. I know it existed before and it had been written up in academic papers, but as far as I know, it was at least the first big-scale use of that technique, which is now being used by lots of ZK projects. All right, Alex.
Yeah, hi everyone. First of all, let me just say it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. It's amazing to see, I've been in the space for about 5 years now. It's amazing to see the Cosmos ecosystem just grow in the way that it has. So again, it's a real pleasure to be here and be part of this event. I'm Alex. I'm the COO of Aleo. Aleo is a platform for private applications. Similar to, probably some of the things that these guys have described, this is things that potentially benefit from privacy. And I really love the way that Henry framed it. It's like you can't just, you can pound the table all day and say, you should care about privacy, but fundamentally, I think, all of us, should focus on how privacy makes something fundamentally better or enables something that hasn't before. So anyway, at Aleo, what we try and do is take the Zcash basically paradigm and extend it to more general programmability. And I think maybe the other different thing about Aleo that I'll mention is we have a consensus algorithm that specifically tries to incentivize proof generation, and with the hopes of making it more economical, more efficient over time, and to therefore bootstrap this as a paradigm into the ecosystem more broadly and help integrate these private applications across Web3.
So when it comes to privacy projects, I feel like there are different kind of levels of how private something is. You have the model that Zcash sort of pioneered, which is to have a shielded, or cloaked, as I'm going to keep trying to use, portion, and a transparent portion. So part of the blockchain you can actually map like any other, and part of it is hidden. And I wondered for each of these projects, like what parts are private and which parts are actually public? This might be something interesting for people to understand. So maybe we'll go this way? Yeah.
Reverse? Yeah. By the way, is cloaked the new term?
So I'm trying.
I kind of like it, actually. It's
like of Star Trek.
Yeah, Star Trek, yeah, I'm into it.
Cloaked and decloaked.
Yeah, I'm into it. Anyway, so I guess maybe just as a general answer to the question, there's a couple different dimensions of privacy that you might care about as a user, right? So one is you have an identity that you're using on chain, which could be your account or something, and maybe you would like the fact that you would like that identity to be obfuscated in some interaction, right? So you don't want one of the interacting parties or an observer to know who you are. So that's kind of one dimension. And then the other is like, what is the interaction? Like, what is the program basically being run? And maybe you would want to obfuscate that program. Like, for example, if you're participating in a dark pool or something like that, there's potentially reasons, for example, trading to, want to hide the fact that you're participating in a dark pool. Because if you're trading in a large enough amount, or you're a specific player, say you're a large venture fund exiting a position, obviously just that knowledge alone that a program is being accessed might trigger actions that you don't want to necessarily, trigger. So I think those are and then of course, I guess the last thing, and since we're talking about Web3, is like the transaction amounts, right? So sometimes, like, for example, Tornado is like, it's the way it works is kind of more as like a mixer. So you're kind of mixing the amounts that are going in. So maybe the amount or the specific data or state at which you're accessing, you might want to hide too. So yeah, I guess I'll leave it there in the desire to have it general, or do you want me to talk more about Aleo specifically?
No, so I guess the question here is, are there parts of Aleo that are transparent?
Yeah, so the model that I like and that we try and strive for at Aleo is private by default. So you can actually hide all of these various aspects. And for those of you who are curious, Aleo kind of came out of this academic work, which is ZKV, stands short for Zero Knowledge Execution. And the whole goal of that was to try and extend Zcash effectively and enable both, privacy of the individuals interacting as well as the program being accessed. I think one thing that often gets overlooked in conversations about privacy and private applications is it's sometimes very convenient to have public state which is accessed. And so, I think this is sort of, I think it has to be left up to the application developer on like, okay, what am I trying to do here? What parts do I want to let the user choose whether or not they want to disclose? What parts of the program state do I want to make public? And the bottom line is, I think, protocols, in my view, should strive to make that up to the developer of the application. So you want to hide everything, you want to hide some stuff, maybe there's a selective disclosure. And if you think about it, just the last thing is, if you think about it, that's exactly how our financial system works already. It's like, if I send Emre a bank wire, it's not like I know his account balance, right? Like, I can tell him, or I can tell the IRS, and selectively disclose what I choose to. But by default, it's effectively private. And I think this by default private, but by exception public is the paradigm which will, I think, it kind of let you have the best of both worlds.
Also, I'm not trying to compare you on levels of privacy. I think there are use cases where more privacy is needed, and there's use cases where actually it might be good to have either a selective disclosure or even a transparent. Anoma, what parts are private? How does it work?
You can look at this from a couple of perspectives, right? You can look at this, what is private on the protocol side, what is private on user sides. I think starting from the user, privacy by default really, really matters, because especially if you have shared privacy sets, because privacy is a public good, as in even like I benefit from a bunch of other people being private because it enhances my privacy in the system actually. So we want to incentivize people to by default always be private, because it increases the privacy set that we can all rely upon. This is also why it's like not a great model that we want to have separate privacy sets. Like when you think on, for example, like Tornado Cash, you have privacy sets between the different denominations and the different assets, and like that heavily starts segmenting the privacy guarantees that you're getting. So privacy by default is, I think, very important. But then it also comes down to, so like users can effectively choose how much privacy they want. They can be fully private. They can decide to be fully transparent. This is, in the end, up to the user. Because for some things, you need to leak some data, right? If you're a pure execution environment, that's not as important, because you don't generally need to coordinate with other parties.
Yeah.
But for example, if you're in this model where I have like a CryptoKitty and I want to sell it to someone, or I have some Bitcoin and I want to buy concert tickets in Barcelona for them, this kind of selective disclosure where you can discover counterparties with whom to work on achieving a settlement for mutual benefit, you need some amount of disclosure in order to discover counterparties. If you say everything is private all the time, it's very, very hard to have to discover counterparties around the world, unless you say, well, we have like the protocol is always the counterparty, which is sort of the kind of AMM model.
Don't you also need it somewhat for like oracles, for like price
Right.
things?
So a bunch of other things in these systems also need to be public, and I would argue that like proof of stake, for example, it's still a fairly modern thing. There's an argument to be made that this should be public because you want to understand what the security model of your chain is. Same for bridges, most likely. Bridges are still very hacky, and it's like way easier to recover from faults if you have public state instead of private state. So I think we can think on privacy on the user side, and there we want to give people the ability to be as private as they want to be, but also to be as transparent as they want to be, because we can't really estimate the use cases that developers and end users have in mind. So we should make it very cheap for them to be private, but not force it onto them.
Got it.
And then on the protocol side, as this tech matures, sure, we can be more and more private, but sort of at certain linchpins, I think it makes sense to be public. Yeah.
Cool. And Mina.
Yeah, I'd say Mina has a similar approach where we're not super opinionated about privacy necessarily. In fact, Mina did not start off as a privacy project. It started more of as a project that kind of breaks this scalability trilemma by having this, fixed size, tiny node, and you can, scale it as much as you want. But what we're seeing nowadays is, and as well as having the best, zero knowledge primitives, and what I call our aim is to be the most efficient ZK state layer in Web3. And what we're seeing now is that, the best use cases there are about making, for Mina at least, making user data private. So instead of, if I want to use a DeFi app or an NFT app or a DAO or whatever, instead of having to make every action that I take public or every data that I need to provide public, instead I provide attestations, whether it's about my, personal financial information or my KYC or my DAO voting rights or what I voted, right? Where, people then, can make attestations instead of sharing the data. And then also, it's what we're discovering. It's fairly easy to build layer ZK rollup type layer 2s on top of Mina. So in fact, like a handful of developers are using the alpha of our SDK, and one of them has already started building like basically a shielded transaction layer on top of Mina for native Mina tokens as well as third-party tokens. So how I would position it is like if you have super easy to use, powerful ZK primitives, then all of this stuff becomes much more easy to build as an application ecosystem. And that's what we want to enable, at least for the Mina ecosystem.
Cool.
So yeah, I think there's like a little bit of a contrast in that like Penumbra is like quite opinionated about privacy. And specifically like picks like a very, very narrow and like focused use case. And if we rewind all the way back to the way that you introduced the panel, there's, I think, an interesting perspective there. So looking at Zcash, there's the transparent part that was forked from Bitcoin, and then there's the shielded part. And if you go back and think about the history, right, that project started at a time when, a ZK chain had never been built. And also at the same time, the rest of the blockchain ecosystem was much, much less secure. Or, sorry, not
Private.
Mature.
Oh.
Sorry. That is, I mean, probably both. But much less mature.
It probably became
in
secure
particular,
over time.
that you didn't have, like, IBC didn't exist. Like, people were just, like, talking about, like, oh, what if we could do, like, cross-chain atomic swaps? Wouldn't that be cool? And I think you had much more of a sense in which like each chain had to be its own universe. And I think what's interesting about the context that we have today is that the development of cross-chain mechanisms allows individual chains to have like some specialization for a particular use case. And so, for instance, for Penumbra, right, like having transparent transactions is not something that we're going to do. But that's not because we believe that no one should ever do this, ever. It's because, like, if you want to go and do like a non-private smart contract, you should like do an IBC transfer over to Juno, where there's like people that's their whole thing, right? And our whole thing is like this like private DEX thing. And so I think that's like kind of I think a little bit of a different approach than trying to build a more general platform. I don't think that's sort of, I don't mean that it's like I don't think there's any like value judgment in there. It's just like a different kind of strategy. And to some extent, it's also because like, like Aleo exists, right? So like there's no point in us trying to build like this like generic like ZK smart contract system, because this is already being worked on, right?
Yeah, and I think I loved how you framed that, and I personally believe that the future is going to be application-driven rather than protocol-driven. I mean, all four of us up here arguably are kind of building protocols. I mean, Henry, you're obviously working on the most specific version of a protocol, but I think the future is naturally going to go to a place where people have a demand for a product. The protocol underneath it will naturally be built to serve the product that people want, right? And I think even in Aleo, although we're building a more general platform, and I don't think that Aleo is the right choice for every Web3 application. And one of the things that differentiates us from for example, Ethereum is we don't have a model of an on-chain VM, which in some ways is limiting. In some ways it's very powerful, but in some ways is limiting. So I think it really depends on what you're doing. Similar to privacy, like you said, for some things like NFTs, I mean, for some applications of NFTs, privacy may be important, but for just like showing off whatever NFT you have, I mean, kind of privacy is the opposite of the point, right? You want people to know that this NFT is yours and you want to show it off. And maybe that's a bad example, but I think everywhere, I would encourage all of you who are at this event and hopefully at future events and going forward to think about just these trade-offs being made at a lower level and how those percolate up to potential applications that you could or could not build. Because I think there's room, there's a massive space to experiment. And there's a huge number of different ways these protocols and products could look in this paradigm. Yeah. So yeah, 100% agree.
Actually, on this product perspective, I mean, this is something that we're doing at the protocol level, where we are building the first chain in the Anoma ecosystem is going to be called Namada, to just focus on a very narrow use case, which is multi-asset privacy for any connected asset, where it's just like you want to have a single, very large shielded pool that has ETH, that has DAI, that has atoms, that can have effectively anything that's bridgeable. At the moment via IBC, and they all just live in the single shielded pool. You can do proofs in the web browser in like 3 seconds. And you can even move an NFT into this. This is a cool thing. Like for NFTs, you currently don't have any good privacy solutions. But if you have a multi-asset shielded pool, you can have an NFT in the same shielded pool, and it benefits and it sort of inherits the privacy guarantees you get from all the other fungible assets, because to an external observer, it's indistinguishable whether you move your NFT or some DAI.
If I can add one last thing, wrap everything up, maybe
Sure.
not to be the odd one out. I would say, and this is a bit preaching to the choir, given this is the Cosmos ecosystem, but there's no doubt it's a multi-chain world going forward. And every chain inevitably, whether it designs itself to be or whether it says, oh, I'm just the most general smart contract platform ever, even in that latter case, they're all going to start naturally finding their optimal, frontier, if you will. I don't know, maybe Ethereum just ends up being, the asset settlement platform going forward, right? But it's not going to be the privacy layer, right? So I think we just have to accept that, it's a multi-chain world at this point.
It actually comes with a lot of benefits to end users as well. If you think on building privacy tech on Ethereum, you inherit a bunch of transparent stuff that ultimately becomes a massive privacy leak for you. But whereas if you sort of look at the entire stack in an integrated fashion, you can very quickly build very good products that deliver specific use cases for people that are hard to build in sort of a fully generalized manner.
Sort of speaking of that connection point, we did a panel earlier today where we talked about bridging. We mentioned this idea of what happens with a privacy zone or privacy chain once it has to bridge away. And I guess currently in all cases, the minute you take that leap outside of your L1, you will inevitably be revealing something. But have you been thinking about that as are you thinking of creating extensions of what you're doing, extending the privacy space into those bridges? I mean, at this point,
the ideal thing would be to have cross-chain shielded pools. Actually, let's call them shielded soups because they're not
cloaked.
Okay.
Anyway, nobody's picking up my thought.
Cross-chain cloaked soups. All right. No, but this is
trying it out here.
This is still early research, right? To get to cross-chain pools or cross-chain shielded pools. I think for now, honestly, if you start breaking, because you break linkability quite a bit. So if you go into a private ecosystem and then you go out of it, You can go out to completely new addresses. They are not linkable to your old addresses that used to go into the private ecosystem. So to me personally, I think there's not a lot of need to build super private bridges at the moment, because as long as like you just sort of taking public routes between private things, it doesn't really matter the routes that you're taking are private. I mean, eventually leak some metadata, but this is sort of a problem we can worry about maybe in like 4 years from now.
Okay.
Not right now.
Yeah.
We have to, I mean, we just have to consider this, right? On the privacy side, there is the amount of privacy preserving tech out there right now is so limited. Like, it's tiny. And I think we should really focus on making private applications a reality before you sort of start thinking like, how does this need to look like in the perfect world?
Right, because the kind of the default case, right, is that like a layer one like Aleo, for example, could if it was connected to some other ecosystems, could kind of be effectively a mixer, right? So you could go from, let's say, Solana to Aleo and then to Ethereum or something. You could it basically functions the same as a mixer. You know, and these bridges, oftentimes the focus is just about passing those messages, and in some ways, like, you need that information to be public for security reasons or just for functional reasons. But I think it's an interesting unexplored design space, you know, because again, we're talking, all of us are kind of more privacy or ZK focused projects, but you know, if we're talking about bridges between, say, Solana and Ethereum or something, I think it is kind of an unexplored design space to kind of figure out, you know, could you, without kind of having an intermediate layer one protocol, be a mixer? Like, is there a way to kind of make that private? I'm not aware of anybody who's kind of looking at that, but it's interesting.
It's hard.
It's hard.
And
Bridges are hard.
just to sort of mention something
Private
that was,
bridges are hard.
it was in the, oh, do you want to say something before?
Just as a riff on that, I think that I don't have like a lot of optimism that that type of design would work out. And the reason is precisely because if you have a private L1, you can use it as a private bridge. I think having, I think that the development of a private L1 that can talk to transparent chains is going to basically obsolete the development of any kind of private bridging between transparent chains, because why would you do that when you can just, like, you know, go through any of the private zones?
Something that came up in the previous panel as well was this idea that when we think about privacy and bridges, we have, I have had a tendency to think of it as like cloaked, wait, I gotta keep my own term going, hidden tokens, basically. It's always token transfer, but as Sergey mentioned, what if it's messages that actually have actions on those destination chains that are private? Then it's not so much like I don't know if that also reveals as much as if you were doing token transfers in and out. I don't know if you've thought about that.
I guess I think that part of the reason that people are focused on token transfers is that it's like a simple thing that people haven't done yet, right? Like, in order to do like private messaging between applications, like you first have to like have the private applications, right? So I think that part of the kind of, I don't know that that's really about some kind of like narrow-mindedness or that people aren't imagining this thing, but just that it's like there's a big gap between imagining the like glorious ZK future in which everything is private and, like, you know, maybe we could build like one like private thing that actually clearly has product market fit first.
Yeah.
I wanted to add there, to Henry's point, like, this is my pet peeve is also like, tokens is the only thing that exists in Web3 at scale today. Like, it's all speculation, right? And to build these, these applications that are about so much more than that, you do need some sort of privacy at the state update mechanism, right? Because, like, for example, in how Mina approaches this is, Mina is by design, is basically any chain can run a full node of Mina within itself. But what the other chain is hearing from Mina is just various state updates into a specific, application that's running on Mina. So how that state update is achieved, that's where the magic of zero knowledge happens, where like the proofs get posted on chain and they trigger the state update, as opposed to the logic running on chain and the chain determining in a transparent way how the state update happens. So I think this goes also kind of to the off-chain versus on-chain distinction, where the more you can do some things beyond the token world off-chain, the more privacy you get to preserve. There's also other benefits, such as operational efficiency. But I think that's a paradigm shift that we all need to start getting into as an ecosystem.
I think Henry has a response.
I'm not sure that I agree that it is always better to move things off-chain, but I think that there's actually there's a kind of an interesting way to look at sort of like differences between projects, and like I don't want to sort of, well, I'll just sort of say things, and then if I say things that are wrong, then I can just be immediately corrected. But if you think about, for instance, the way that ZKV, which Aleo is built on, the model is almost like every transaction is like a micro roll-up, right? Like there's some smart contract state, and the way that the execution happens is that someone is going to execute the contract and then produce a proof of the execution and then submit that to the chain. And it's like, bundled up, but effectively it's like a roll-up, but at kind of this like arbitrarily small scale. And the thing that's really cool about that is that, right, the actual application data doesn't have to be on chain, but the problem that it doesn't really solve is like who is actually executing the smart contract. And so there's kind of two possible alternate approaches to that. One, which we're working on, is like, okay, well, we'll zoom into a very specific type of application and see how we can do some kind of like additive aggregation of input values. And then another is with Anoma. Part of this was like a really cool thing that like clicked for me recently, so hopefully it's correct. Like the reason that there's like, it makes sense to have a bartering system that's built into this system is that it's like you're kind of bartering like different people's like potential state updates.
That is actually a very good way to describe this, yes.
Yeah, I think I really love what you said. And by the way, for everybody who ever wants to get someone building a privacy protocol in Knots, just ask them to whiteboard you in 5 minutes, how you would build private Uniswap. And you will see people do many backflips. Because either typically, I mean, it's complicated, right? Because as Henry's pointing out, and let's just take the ZKV model, right? You're taking this off-chain, you're doing an on-chain, computation. Who is running that computation? In ZKV, it's the user, right? But Uniswap is kind of built on this idea of a smart contract, which requires an on-chain VM, right? And so, you have, but at the same token, the on-chain VM model typically is the account model, and the account model is very hard to make private, right? Mm-hmm. So you kind of end up in this weird space. So anyway, it's a fascinating question to ask people, for any of you in the audience. The last thing I'll say though quickly is, I think there's a world, and what we haven't touched on yet is, I wonder if there's a world in which you can hybridize these two models, right? One thing we're looking at Aleo potentially is to have some concept of like a hybrid off-chain and on-chain computation, where you can imagine a user basically kind of almost like meta transactions, where you construct a transaction and then you forward it to some approver or some other entity that basically sequences and or finalizes the transaction. And maybe this paradigm enables you to hide the things that you care about hiding, but it still gives you this advantage of having concurrency and composability, which I think are the main advantages of an on-chain VM model.
To maybe clarify this a little bit, it's technically not the VM. It's like, so the reason why you can't build Uniswap privately is because you've like someone needs to hold the state, right? Like, and in like Uniswap on Ethereum, the contract holds that state because the reason why you can't do it privately is because the person that constructs the proof is the person that interacts with the contract, and that person necessarily needs to hold the shared state in order to be able to construct the proof. I think long term there's actually some interesting research we can be doing, and I think some of us are already doing, around fully homomorphic encryption and how we can have shared private state sort of for longer periods of times. And you can even think more like I'm thinking now between the message passing, right? You want to invoke some cross-chain, like you want to invoke some other L1 in a private manner. What you could actually do is like, how long do you need these messages to be private? If it's just for front-running protection, you just really need like a couple of blocks privacy where it's encrypted before they're executed. So there's sort of a breadth of design space out there, how we can think on how do we make more and more of this ecosystem private. And ZK, like zero-knowledge proofs aren't the end all. There's a ton more open research that's probably going to take another 10 years to materialize into production-ready apps.
Yeah, I do. So I agree the state matters, but also I do think the VM does matter for a model like Zexy, right? Like if you're creating a proof about a state that even if it's public, you can just put everything on chain, just publicly, just make it public data. But even then, you have these records that can only be updated by one person at a time, right? So like, unlike Ethereum, this is solved because every node is a sequencer, right, effectively, because they just decide, okay, hey, the mempool looks, and this, by the way, is why front running is a problem, right? Because if you're the sequencer, you're like, that looks like a good trade, I might just take it. So this is why, again, like this is like, I think it's a really interesting kind of tension between these different properties that we're trying to achieve.
I want to bring this back to Cosmos, the other side of the privacy in Cosmos. How do you, I mean, I think in the case of Penumbra, there's very clear connections already to Cosmos and IBC, but yeah, how are you all thinking about actually this ecosystem? Is this an ecosystem that you see yourselves bridging to or working with bridging projects to get kind of connected to? And how could maybe people in the Cosmos ecosystem start to think about your projects?
Yeah, I mean, from the Anoma side, Anoma wants to bridge to everything. At the moment, by far, the best bridging tech out there is IBC. So I would really say everyone should be building IBC adapters for every other chain. Like people should be out there building IBC adapters for Near, for Flow, for Polkadot, you name it. Pretty much any fast finality BFT chain, someone currently should be building an IBC adapter because that makes, not necessarily to connect it to Cosmos, but to make all chains connected to each other, because this makes the ecosystem much more composable. If you can all of a sudden do a Penumbra, Aleo, Anoma, Mina hop, because all these chains just have a common interoperability standard. This is the way I think about bringing privacy to the entire blockchain ecosystem, just by getting people to implement IBC, because it's a great protocol.
But what about like an EVM? Like what about EVM to EVM? Do you think that it should also be like Evmos to Moonbeam, or should both be IBC?
Yes.
Is that the most effective way to do that?
Yes, this is the thing. Like IBC has very little, actually, I think has no dependencies on the specific state machine. Like it has a dependency on the consensus, as in it needs to be a fast finality BFT consensus. It doesn't matter whether you're running an EVM on that consensus or some ZKVM. That's secondary. This is like any BFT chain should be implementing IBC to just talk to other BFT chains.
Yeah, in the case of Mina, agree with that, by the way, although I know the Nomad folks are doing some cool stuff there too for EVM, but side note. In the case of Mina, as I mentioned briefly, Mina is designed to be a full node, whether you're on a client, a traditional client, or you're on another blockchain, right? So we're incentivized to bring value to every other layer 1 or layer 2 ecosystem out there by providing this kind of user data privacy layer to the other chains out there, whether that's Cosmos, whether that's Ethereum, Solana, what have you. In fact, there has been what we call a trusted ZK bridge from Mina to Ethereum that's been in progress for a while. Hopefully there's going to be some sort of a demo or an overview in ETH Amsterdam in the next week, next weekend. And that by nature is default for any other EVM chain as well. So for example, Evmos in the case of Cosmos, but then also is not VM dependent either. It's just engineering that needs to be done for an efficient smart contract verifier of the canonical ZK state of Mina. So our goal is to basically just bring some of the unique features that we can to every other, specifically about ZK, to every other layer 1 ecosystem out there.
What would someone in the Cosmos ecosystem be able to do with that?
Yeah, so let's say you're an AMM, or let's say you're a lending pool on Evmos or Cosmos or whatever, and you don't only want to serve over collateralization for your for your lending logic, you want to be able to underwrite users. For that, you need data on your users, whether it's their identity or whether it's their financial background, how much salary they're making. And let's be honest, as much as we'd like, 99.999% of the world is not using blockchain for their daily stuff, other than maybe buying and selling and speculating. So you need to be able to ingest that data in a private way, because no one is going to put their, this is how much I'm getting from my employer every month in my bank account. You're not going to put that on chain.
Surprised.
Unless you work in blockchain.
Well,
then apparently it's all public.
Yeah, but I personally don't think that's a viable future. So, so there, Mina can provide this rails where users are easily able to bring, using zero knowledge, easily able to bring in attestations about their data, whether it's their credit score or their credit history or anything else about whatever the underwriter might require. And then have that automatically settle down to, let's say, Evmos, just because it's the straightforward answer here, automatically settle down to Evmos, because Evmos would be running a full node of Mina and be aware of all these state updates. So that's kind of the end-to-end flow that we're imagining here. It's such that any other layer 1 application can benefit from this ZK attestation superpower.
Cool.
I think it's similar for Aleo, so I won't rehash all that. But I guess the one thing I just quickly want to highlight, and full intellectual credit to the O of 1 folks and Isaac and and the folks over there. This idea of this recursive proof, right? One of the things about that snarks let you do, aside from cloak or conceal, is compress, right? And this is about compressing a lot of state into a small proof. This is how rollups effectively work. But I think it's overlooked as a tool for bridging, right? 'Cause it enables you to take a lot of state or a current state and compress that down as something that's relatively lightweight. And this is exactly, so effectively most bridges are implemented as light clients on the destination chain. If you have a very light client, then that can be a very powerful tool that, again, Mina, again, or the O of 1 folks kind of came up with this concept. Others, including Cello, we also have a kind of a recursive light client that we use at Aleo, but I think in general, this is a concept that can be adopted, and I think is the future for bridging across the space, is using this compressing property of zero-knowledge proofs to potentially make it easier to run full light clients on, as destinations of whatever bridge.
My confession is that I was listening and then forgot the question.
The question was, how are you connected to Cosmos? But for you, it's pretty easy.
Yeah, I think for us, it's fairly straightforward. I think that part of the kind of meta there is that...
Not Meta, the company.
No.
Okay. We can't use that word anymore, by the way.
I've actually succeeded in not having that be part of my brain.
Okay.
So
I wish I was so lucky.
Yeah. So part of the thought there is about how do we sort of have a small scope that we think we could definitely build, and I think part of the reason, like I mentioned a little while ago, is the idea that if you have really pervasive bridging, you can intentionally specialize and narrow the scope that one project needs to do. And so for us, I think sort of how do we, what is our relationship with sort of everything else in Cosmos? It's okay, well, everything except for the 4 bullet points that were on one of my slides of stake, transact, swap, and market make. Literally everything except for that, you should go and use another chain. And that strategy only works because of sort of intentionally conceptualizing ourselves as part of this interchain ecosystem, rather than being trying to, we're not trying to build an ecosystem, we're just living in one.
Cool. All right, I feel like I've taken up a lot of time with these panelists. I do want to open it up to the floor. I don't know if anyone has any other questions. I do have more stuff if you don't, but I wanted to share the option. So yeah, this is questions for our ZK and privacy experts.
Hey guys, good panel. Sorry, a couple of questions. I guess first, I'm curious what percent of applications do you think will end up being privacy preserving in the blockchain or Web3 ecosystem, right? Because traditionally, like in Web2, it's been an uphill battle and the percent is actually pretty low. Kind of curious from the demand that you're seeing, just give me a number and kind of think through this. And I think a second question that I have is around security and how you think about it. Kind of, ZK privacy preserving tech in general is very complex, right? And like a lot of credit to a lot of the builders. Curious how you approach security, how you think about, audits and things like that, and how do you think about catastrophic kind of failures when privacy or when there is a bug, when the privacy is leaked and compromised, kind of how you think through those things. Thank you.
Yeah.
Percentage is the first one.
Yes. So you mentioned the example of Web 2, and not a lot of things are privacy preserving in Web 2. I would actually push back against this and say the model is different, right? Because your bank is private to 99.999% of the world population. It is public to the organization. The same is true for Twitter, Facebook. Pretty much all Web 2 things are privacy preserving against the general public, unless you're like a nation state. Like if you're the NSA, then you're not private against the NSA, but pretty much against everyone else, you're fully private. And I think as a result, if we want to build Web 3, we really have to think, how do we get to a similar model where very, very few people have access to all the data? Because currently the model we have is Ethereum and everything is public. And just think for a moment that like world finance moves to Ethereum tomorrow, and everyone is fully public. Like this is not like that it's Web 2 public. It's like, no, everything is completely public on every human on Earth. And the next day, someone sort of in the middle of nowhere with internet connection can run a global financial mass surveillance program by having an internet connection. It is like we have to be way more privacy conscious in Web 3 than in Web 2 because we don't have a bunch of institutions that effectively guarantee our privacy for most parts against the rest of the world. So I would say like we probably need, I don't know, practically speaking, 99% of all applications on Web 3 eventually need to be private, because otherwise this is like a significantly worse security guarantee and privacy guarantee than Web 2 for most normal users of these systems.
I was going to say the exact same thing. Well, not the exact same. No. I mean, but what I would add to that is, like, at the end of the day, blockchains are a global state layer, right? That's what they are, and not everything needs, a global state layer either, right? So it's in my opinion, it's going to be a part of, the internet. And if you cannot somehow preserve your privacy within this spectrum, then you may not need to be using a sort of a Web3 landscape. But then also on top of it, what percentage of Web3, if we ask it that way, I think it also depends. An average user, I would say, yeah, like definitely 95% of it will end up being private, because I don't see anyone in their right mind sharing this much information, on an ongoing basis. But maybe as a, in a TVL sense, maybe it's less than that, because ultimately, if you kind of, as a user, you interact with some private layer, and then that settles down to, again, maybe Ethereum ends up being this global settlement layer for all the value, and it's not private, and that's fine, because what you're seeing on Ethereum doesn't give you information on a per user basis. It's aggregated, so that might end up being not private by definition, but also private in some other sense.
Not linkable.
Yeah, I think the first two. So I agree with what these two gentlemen said on the kind of importance of privacy. I think you asked a second question though, which is around complexity. I think it's a great point, and remember, one of the hard things about private protocols is that if something goes wrong, sometimes you can never know. I mean, Zcash very famously had a bug, and was it ever exploited? Do we know? I mean, probably not. But
we
again,
know it hasn't been exploited yet.
Oh, okay, well, we know that
the turnstile hasn't been broken.
So, but the point is, like, these things could go undiscovered, and that's a little bit dangerous.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I think in some ways it's more secure because you're putting more assumptions on cryptography. Whereas if you look at like a lot of Web3, there's so much. I mean, one of the greatest innovations, or arguably the innovation of that enabled Web3 is this game theoretic security, right? But when you start layering game theory on game theory, at some point the assumptions, you have to question whether or not it will actually work, right? I mean, there's been this concept that's kind of been around for a long time, thinking about, like Ethereum validators are all supposed to rerun every state transition exactly step by step by step. But do they? Like, or do they just take whatever node they got it from's word for it, right? If they're like, okay, this block came through, do I really need to re-execute these transactions? I mean, they're kind of not really incentivized to. So I guess if you're thinking about, does Ethereum provide me as much, or does any model that relies on game theoretic consensus actually provide me the security I'm thinking I'm getting? I don't know. I think it's a much less definitive answer than a cryptographic proof, right? Where, I mean, the idea is if you believe the math, you know, of course there's flaws found in these things all the time, but fundamentally it's a much, much smaller window if you can design it right. Now, these systems are brand new, and of course, because, like, ask any cryptographer, they'll be like, if it hasn't existed for 50 years, it's broken. You know what I mean? Like, that's just the attitude, and that's an attitude for a reason, but, you know, I think we're going to get there. And I think the fundamental assumptions that these are resting on, I think in some ways are stronger.
I think on point 2, we should be doing way more formal verification of cryptographic protocols because they give us fairly high assurances that these systems are correct. I think we shouldn't. This is sort of why I'm terrified of this one chain to rule them all narrative, especially around Ethereum, right? That, like, we should design these systems that are interconnected where components can fail independently. We shouldn't build like one global financial system on Ethereum or on any other blockchain for that matter. We should have many different blockchains and they should all be able to catastrophically fail, but when they fail, they only kill themselves. They don't kill everything else. Whereas if you have like, imagine a model where like everything is settled on one security model, you all of a sudden have this problem that like, well, the security model may fail due to cryptographic assumptions. And all of a sudden, like the financial system just breaks. Like this is not how we should be building way more for resilience, and that necessarily means that like we need interconnected systems that can fail independently.
Whoa.
And sadly, most of the ways that most money is lost in Web3 today are just like way more benign than that. Like, I mean, it's almost a good problem if we get to the point where someone's exploiting this like deep down dark fissure of a protocol because there's so much low hanging fruit, unfortunately. But yeah, no, I think it's a reasonable concern.
Yeah, I think I kind of laughed a little bit when Adrian mentioned the sort of like if we imagine like tomorrow the entire world financial system like is on Ethereum, like if you think about like how that ecosystem actually works, like that concept is like really hilarious. But to the first part about privacy, like because of that baseline of public blockchains just being like this complete like information free-for-all, I think that the kind of the bar has gone a lot lower than it even was in Web 2. And so with respect to the privacy aspect, I think that as the deployment of ZK systems matures, we're going to have to start getting into more nuance about like, okay, private to whom, right? If you have a model like Mina or Aleo, you could actually imagine like doing a lot of like the kind of Web 2 level of privacy, but just with this extra assurance that actually all of the data was like executed correctly, because you can commit that onto this chain and use that as the settlement layer. And I think we're going to sort of see this like spectrum of different like levels of privacy, where maybe in some cases, there's someone who's like relatively trusted. Maybe in other cases, there's attempts to try to minimize that through engineering. On the second point about the kind of assurance of the cryptography, this is something that I'm actually very optimistic about, but not for any kind of technical reason. It's actually a social reason. And that reason is that if you look, right, like the bug in Zcash, right? Like, that bug was not exploited because at the time that it existed, there were like 12 people in the entire world who like even understood that could happen,
and they all
worked on Zcash, right? Like,
it's both reassuring and not assuring, but yeah.
Right, but if you look at what's happened in the last, say like 4 or 5 years, and in large part because of like the leadership of Zcash, right? Like now you have this whole ecosystem of all these people who are developing like really, really good production quality implementations of quite complex cryptography, right? Like the fact that Mina exists is just like incredible, right? And it's not because there's some like technical advance that's driving that. It's because there is now this like production of people who do really serious real world ZK stuff. And that is only gonna keep growing. And so I think like that like force is gonna like wash out like all of the technical details, the formal verification, like people are gonna build the tools, like it's gonna happen because there's
Cool.
just,
The momentum.
it's there.
Oh,
And it's the power of open source.
last point, because we're...
One very quick thing. When I explain like why I'm excited about Web3 to other tech people, non-Web3 tech people, I agree with like the point about like more cryptography professionals and more better cryptography. But also like this whole space is an amazing Trojan horse to get cryptography into the hands of everyday people, right? Like no one in Web2 has like very few people have a public-private key pair in their hands. But anyone with a MetaMask, extension because they want to buy some NFT, they get this public-private key pair, and they can then use it for other things, which I think is amazing.
Amazing. All right. Sorry. Yeah, this was amazing. Thank you so much for doing the panel. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I know we're a little bit late, but yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you for having us.
And I think if anyone is interested in learning more about these teams, you will be sticking around, I hope. I do want to let everyone know, especially those who came later, we're actually doing a dinner later tonight here. So this event ends around 5:20 now because I think we're 20 minutes late or 30 minutes late, 5:30. And then at 7, we're also doing a dinner here and you're all invited. So I just want to make sure you know that. It would be very cool to hang out and we might try to do karaoke. Do you know this? Okay, some people weren't here for the intro, so I thought I should let you know. Okay, cool. Thanks a lot.